Oh, I think we missed Mimi's voice. Okay, welcome everybody. Ancient Christianity, number 2. Just a little background on kind of where we've been and where we're going. The goal here is to go from the death of Christ right up to Constantine's conversion, so a 300-year period. My goal was to do that in 3 classes and spend the last class focused on Paul. We are moving at a little slower pace than I anticipated, but I was also really overly optimistic with the number of slides and what I hope to cover. And so what I'm thinking is I do have the latitude and the schedule to just keep going at the pace we're doing, and to just move the introduction to Paul to our Paul Bible study. The other thing I'm realizing I was a little ambitious on is I've started to work on our Paul Bible study. And what I'm realizing is I had combined some of the letters, and they're really a lot to do in those letters. And so what I'm thinking I might do is slow down Paul a little and not do it in 5 weeks, instead do it and take it into January. And then we would take a little more time off and go into Luke then probably in March. So that's where I'm leaning right now, as opposed to kind of rushing through this, is to take the time to really kind of enjoy it, make sure we've got time for the art and the videos and the conversations. And if it takes us all 4 weeks, it'll take us all 4 weeks. So that's currently the plan on how we're going to approach it. Okay. Go ahead and share my screen. Okay, here's where we're at. Just a little kind of recentering on where we've been. So what we learned about early Christianity so far, wildly diverse. This was popping up in lots of different places, lots of different people trying to make sense of this Jesus encounter. We know that within 15 years of Jesus's death, there were little tiny communities all over the Mediterranean struggling with what Jesus meant. We know that these initial followers were Jesus. They were keeping this, or were Jewish. They were keeping the Sabbath. They were keeping the Jewish food laws. They were studying the Jewish scriptures. This was a tiny sect within Judaism, right? So this is a Jewish movement. The earliest leadership was in Jerusalem, Jewish led, James and Peter. James, the brother of Jesus. Peter, we know from the New Testament. This was all happening within the system of Roman domination. We just can't separate early Christianity from the context of which it blossomed, which is the Roman system. And the earliest Christians are all emerging into a system of extreme violence with the destruction of the temple. We learned about that last week. Okay, so moving on, we're going to see for the next 150 or 250 years, as well as when we get into Paul's letter, a common theme of conflict. Lots of conflict and lots of tension. Conflict between the earliest leaders. We're going to hear about that in Paul's letters between James and Peter and Paul. We're going to hear about this in terms of different sects that are going to break off and how these communities are going to respond by claiming heresy. And it's going to come down to an argument over Gentile Jewish. It's all about how to be a true follower of Christ. And you're going to hear that polemic showing up over whose voice is going to reign over what does it mean to be a true follower of Christ. How do they stay true to that message? But there is a lot of conflict to come. Around the 60s and the 70s, you're going to see the end of the leadership, Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. So in 62, James is killed. And the leadership of the Christian community decided to move that out of Jerusalem to areas that were more Gentile focused. So again, in those first couple decades, we had those communities popping up all over the Mediterranean. And you can see right around this time, this is the emerging of the revolt blossoming in Jerusalem. So the Christian leadership is going to pull out and go to other areas. So the vast majority of the Christian leadership was gone. And I shouldn't be using the term Christian. They're not Christian yet. The vast majority of these early followers of Christ are gone by the time of the Jewish revolt. There's still some there, but the leadership has left. We know the temple happens. We know what the temple's destroyed in 70. And then within 50 years of that, the church leadership has completely switched from Jewish to Gentile. Now the Jewish involvement, we're going to talk about this later on, but it's going to stay and be interspersed for centuries to come. But the leadership is going to be switching by the 2nd century. So here gives you an idea on the spread. So the purple is around the year of 185, and the green is when Constantine converts, 325. So you can see even within 150 years of Christ, how that has spread. Greece, modern day Turkey, up into Italy and into Egypt. Okay, so moving out of Jerusalem, let's talk a little bit about who these people were, the earliest church. Sociologists now really think that the earliest followers of Christ came from the lower classes of society. We have historical texts that describe them as ignorant, powerlessness, and obscure at birth. That was a description of these early Christians. There is some indication in early Christian writings that there was this kind of clash of goals between the Roman Empire and what Christ was saying, particularly in regards to economic oppression. And this resonance of Christ creating this new kingdom, this new Jerusalem, that's a term that those of you who did Revelation should know a lot about. That really resonated with this lower economic class of individuals. They came from the cities. Christianity quickly became an urban movement, and this is really critical in terms of how it spread. It spread in Greco-Roman cities. One of the big sociologists who's done a lot of work on this, a guy by the name of Rodney Stark, and he used to teach at the University of Washington. Here's how he describes the cities. Greco-Roman cities were small, extremely crowded, filthy, and beyond imagining, disorderly, filled with strangers, and afflicted with frequent catastrophes, fires, plagues, conquests, and earthquakes. Unlike Western urban life today, where even the poor have access to marginally accepted services, life in antiquity abounded in anxiety and misery for nearly everyone. This is the breeding ground for Christianity. And sociologists think that this really helped contribute to the growth of Christianity. Okay, ancient cities, incredibly dense. So ancient cities like Corinth were 6 times the density of New York City. And New York City does that with high rises. They didn't have high rises. They went maybe 4 stories high, 6 times the density of New York City. Extreme crowding. There was not good plumbing, right? So the streets were full of dumped chamber pots. There was no centralized heating. So they lacked furnaces, they lacked chimneys, they lacked fireplaces. Cooking was done over wood or charcoal burners. So you could see these cities and smell them before you came upon them. urgent problems with sanitation. They were extremely filthy. So, one of the impressions I think that most of us are left with Roman occupation is the aqueducts, right? The clean water. They still exist, right? And water came to a central source, but it also had to be carried back, and that water was almost always contaminated. Disease was running rampant. You could smell these cities before you came upon them. Incredibly high mortality rate. So life expectancy, this came up last time, less than 30 years. And they were peopled by strangers. So people did not have community. They did not know each other. And then this depiction of Antioch, a city filled with misery, danger, fear, despair, and hatred. Some of the drawings of these ancient cities give you kind of a sense of the density and how many people lived in proximity, as well as kind of the channels through these narrow streets for the sewage that was flowing between the buildings. Incredibly dense, incredibly impoverished, peopled by strangers. That was the grounds upon which Christianity flourished. So what did it offer? What did Christianity offer to these urban centers? New types of social relationships, new ways of people to get to know other people, a basis for attachment for newcomers and strangers, this new sense of family for orphans and widows. But also what really was critical here was a safety net. And that Christianity, these Christian communities started to create outreach to the poor and the homeless and the hungry, kind of following those teachings of Jesus and providing nursing services during epidemics, fires, and earthquakes. So this safety net infrastructure was starting to form in these cities as an outreach up from those early Christian communities. This is really well documented by non-Christian historical sources who mock very derisively the early Christians for doing stupid things like sticking around during a plague when everybody else with any good reason got out. That there's some wonderful preserved documents of non-Christians talking about these idiots, these earlier followers of Christ who stayed and nursed the poor, or nursed the sick and buried the dead. Let's talk about the way. Now we've studied MUCC, so this is a term that should be familiar to all of you. Rodney Stark says this about the power of Christianity lay not in its promise of the otherworldly compensations for suffering in this life as so often been proposed. No, the crucial change that took place was the rapidly spreading awareness of a faith that delivered potent antidotes to life's miseries here and now. And again, Stark's research really talks about that power of community and that power of the safety net. So the way, that was a very, very central theme for Christianity for the first 500 years. This is pre-doctrinal systems, pre any theology of a system of salvation. This very simply said, followers lived out Jesus's teachings. And in that way, they were followers of the way. And it was a practical spiritual pathway. It's not what you believe, it's what you do. The earliest Christians were named the people of the way. So we encountered this, right, in Mark 12, 28, 34. Some of you all picked this when we did Bible study on Mark. Which commandment is the first of all? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second of this is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. So this was understood then as the way, the path to salvation, living out faith through these works. Justin Martyr is one of the earliest Christian theologians. Here's something he wrote. We who formerly valued above all things the acquisition of wealth and possession, now bring what we have into a common stock and communicate to everyone in need. We who hated and destroyed one another and on account of their different manners would not live with men of a different tribe, now, since the coming of Christ, live familiarly with them and pray for our enemies. This is living out, being on the way. This was written around the year, I think, 110. The way was not popular. So this was not a popular path. This was not the easy path to take. The way challenged the status quo, and it really angered defenders of Roman religions. As Christianity started to evolve and become distinct from Judaism, it began to get this impression that it was an immoral group, and because of what was known as secretive rites and rituals. Because if you think about the New Testament writings around family, and you think about the inclusiveness of women, these are pretty countercultural to that Roman hierarchical system, patriarchal system. And so folks on the outside looked at these practices of the way as undermining traditional values, Roman traditional values. So they were viewed unfavorably. Revolutionaries, traitors to the good order of the state, because the earliest Christians didn't talk very openly about their practices. There were a lot of rumors, disinformation about the rituals of early Christianity. So early Christians were known as cannibals because they consumed the bread and body of Christ. There was perception that they were engaging in orgies. They were not a popular group, neither by the Romans or by, I think, their peers. So let me stop there. And here's just a question for reflection. The earliest Christians were known as followers of the way. And that's something that we've really lost touch with in Christianity, I think. And one of the benefits of studying the earliest Christians is to call back to memory this recognition that the earliest Christians were not about doctrine or systems. They were known as the followers of the way. So thoughts, reactions to anything I've said so far, or why does it matter that we remember this piece of history? Anyone? Go ahead, Diane.
You know, it's kind of mind-blowing because the way, I mean, and I'm basing it on my favorite gospel, Mark, the way is what Jesus said. I mean, he didn't say a lot, but what he said was all about the way, and showed it in his actions, so that the early Christians doing that, and we are so far away from that in any kind of Christian religion, of that being the basis. I mean, all the rest of the stuff that has put on top of it has hidden really the way.
It's interesting though, all the churches and schools that like the Catholic churches started. I mean, I definitely don't care about the Catholic dogma, but they have followed the way in those ways. You know, they've built a lot of, they were out there with the pioneers, making, you know, starting hospitals and education systems. So.
That theme of creating that safety net continues.
Started a lot of schools.
Yep. Go ahead, Bernie.
Marci, there was a mention of Roman religion. Was there any religion besides the following of Caesar?
So within Roman, the official religion was the empire of the religion, which you believe the emperor, right, was a god. And so you would worship in that manner. But within that, there were multiple pagan beliefs. So like, we're going to talk a little bit about this when we get to Thessalonica. Thessalonica was like the capital of Isis worship. So all of those Roman gods there were temples to all of them throughout the Roman Empire.
Thank you.
Mhm. Anyone else? Okay, we're going to dive in. Oh, go ahead, Liz.
I think that it's very interesting, and I hope that we find out more about how it became so hierarchical.
We're going to talk about how it becomes hierarchical, and I want you to hold on to that thread of conflict, because when in systems that are in conflict and where everyone's trying to come up with an answer, right, that's right for them, ultimately a system seems to impose a hierarchy of determination of that right answer. And so this conflict over everyone trying to figure out who Jesus was and what it meant is going to escalate, and it's going to force basically a hierarchical dogmatic solution. And that's even before Constantine, and then it's going to get worse with Constantine. Yeah. So conflict's really critical as people are figuring this out in terms of how we ended up with a hierarchy. Okay, let's dive into worship. The earliest worship. Okay, so there were no churches, right? So there were no houses of worship. So the earliest Christians would gather in private dwellings. Now we're talking here, moving out of the synagogue. So the earliest Christians, right? The earliest followers of Christ were hearing about Christ in the synagogues. And that has kind of moved on now. And we're seeing early Christians worshiping in private dwellings. So house churches is what you're going to be seeing here. They would typically gather on the first day of the week, Sunday, which was known as Jesus's Resurrection Day. That worship service would always include the Lord's Supper, and it wasn't a little wafer and juice. It was a meal, a really hearty meal. We know that early worship included singing of the Psalms, singing hymns, having teaches, praying in tongues, and healing. Those were all standard elements of a typical Sunday worship. The goal of worship was not on repentance or sins. That was not the focus of early worship. The focus of early worship was on Jesus's resurrection and all of the promises that came with it. So it's not on Good Friday, it's really focused on Easter. The church started celebrating marriages by the beginning of the 2nd century. And they required that all marriages be approved by the bishop. And there's a political reason by this, because when people were coming into a marriage, then they were sharing common assets, and they were basically marrying into the church. So the church wanted some oversight over who their members were marrying. So by the 2nd century, we're seeing kind of this hierarchical involvement in things such as weddings.
Where did the bishops, when did they start having bishops? They said that had to be approved by the bishop.
Yep, so that you start to see the bishops, and we'll go into the hierarchy a little later, but by the end of the 1st century, you're starting to see bishops pop up in different areas.
What was praying in tongues?
Praying in tongues is allowing, and it's something that happens to this day in certain denominations, that people enter into such a deep sense of prayer that they believe spirit comes through them, and they're speaking in a language that is oftentimes difficult to understand what it is. And they believe it's a spirit-inspired speech.
Thank you.
Okay, earliest worship. Everybody had this in common, and regardless of social class. So people of all different social classes, these early followers of Christ coming together and sharing. This is a really important point, because this is actually the foundation of what we're going to encounter in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, which is basically a letter where Paul is going off against the community in Corinth because they're not doing this. Paul finds out that they're having 2 meals on Sunday, 2 services, one for the poor people and one for the wealthy people. And he is furious. And that's why Paul writes the first letter to the Corinthians. He just takes them to task over this. The expectation is everybody worship in common, regardless of social class. And they don't do that in Corinth, and Paul gets angry. So we're going to read that letter. These were happy occasions. They were known as celebrations. They ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God, having the goodwill of all the people. So first part of the service is the reading of the scripture. The earliest Christians, remember, scripture was the Hebrew Bible. They did not have the gospel parts, probably until the beginning of the 2nd century. And they may not have had all of them. We're going to talk about that later on. They would do commentaries on those, kind of a contemporary understanding of preaching and meditations, prayers and hymn singing. Nobody had a copy of the scripture. So there was a lot of extemporaneous preaching and oral communication of the scripture. But the biggest part of the meal was communion, and that was basically the basis of that coming together, was sharing that common meal where everybody brought what they could. By the end of the 2nd century, this was gone. So we lost this pretty early on. This is just something that's been preserved, again, from Justin Martyr, talking about what Sundays were like. And so we do have really good historical sources that have been preserved about early worship, where they wrote down actually how they worshiped and how they came together. So let's talk about the calendar. Again, earliest calendar was just a weekly calendar. Every Sunday was Easter, and every Friday was a day of penance or fasting. And then once a year, they would have a special Sunday to celebrate that day of resurrection. There was no agreement as to when that Sunday should occur. It was a very contentious and bitter kind of debate over when Easter should be celebrated. To this day, we do not all celebrate Easter on the same day. So there is a division, and some Christians celebrate Easter at one point, and other Christians celebrate Easter 2 weeks later. So to this day, we still do not have this in common. Baptism always occurred for new converts on Easter. So it occurred once a year. We're going to talk a little bit more about baptism. I always struggle with this pronunciation. The Didache. The Didache is an ancient Christian instruction manual for worship. And it starts with these words: there are 2 ways, one of life and one of death, but a great difference between the 2 ways. The way of life then is this: first, you love God who made you. Second, love your neighbor as yourself, and do not to another what you would not want done to you. So we all know the source on that one, right? Mark 12. This was basically the book of worship for early Christians for several hundred years. We still have it preserved. It goes through and it talks about all the different steps of worship and how they did it. So this has all been preserved. Okay, I'm going to stop share. I'm going to show you a little video.
The worship of an early Christian house church probably centered around the dinner table. The term communion actually comes from this experience of the dining fellowship. We also know that all other aspects of worship that we think of as going with early Christian practice probably happened around the dinner table as well. Paul refers to one person having a song and another person bringing a prayer. Everyone is contributing to the banquet, whether it's in the form of food or in the form of their piety and worship.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about how you became a Christian. It was not easy. So again, remember, at this point in time, it was tough to be a Christian. The Roman authorities thought Christianity was strange. So Christians refused to acknowledge the Roman Empire as Lord and God. And they refused to be a member of the military. So once Christianity starts to separate off from Judaism, Judaism is recognized as an official religion, right? So they get this waiver. Christians, though, don't have that. And so they're starting to kind of stand out as different. They were viewed as outcasts or weird. They started right within Judaism. They're emerging out of this one. Lots of rumors about what it meant to be a Christian, and they were not the most flattering rumors. The path to becoming a Christian took several years. So converts who were interested in moving into Christianity were looking at anywhere from a 1 to 3 year process where they were undergoing a long series of teachings. So it was considered a choice with serious consequences, and it did have serious consequences on their economic and their livelihood, their safety, even. They believed that you could only learn to be a Christian in community with other Christians. There were no instantaneous conversions, so that was not accepted, or it was frowned upon. We're going to look at some of the baptismal fonts. They looked like coffins because they were intended to symbolize death to an old life and birth to a new life. The earliest church, and we'll hear this in some of the Acts stories, baptized immediately. That was gone by the end of the 1st century. Then we moved into this time of preparation and instruction lasting up to 3 years. At this time, they were starting to receive instructions on Christian doctrine. It was emerging. We'll talk a little bit about that one. And creeds. And we're going to spend some time talking about how we ended up with creeds. They come from this process of baptism. That the earliest creeds were promises or words that converts learned as part of that baptismal ritual. So it was always done on Sunday. They go into the water completely naked, and they come out and they were bathed in these white robes, a sign of new life in Christ. And then they come, and that's the first time they join the communal meal. And then they would give them milk and honey as signs of the promised land. There's no real documentation of the church baptizing infants. So again, if you think about, a 3-year process to prepare people of studying and learning and serving, the potential for the baptism of infants is really not there. You also think about the time frame of St. Augustine, who isn't going to show up for another couple hundred years. And it's there where you get that doctrine and understanding of original sin that necessitates the baptism of infants. This is pre-Augustine. So you're talking pre-original sin, right? So there is no compelling reason to baptize infants. Okay, a couple of some archaeological digs that show the earliest baptismal fonts and how they looked. These are some very, very old churches. Most often in that shape of the cross, not that one, but this one and this one. So they go down into it completely naked, they rise and then are covered in the white robes. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about persecution, but I'm just going to stop there and just check in. Any questions on worship or how to become a Christian? Go ahead, Taylor.
I'm wondering about gender with regards to baptism. Like, were women allowed to join the church in the same way that men were? And if so, were they baptized in community with both men and women, or was it a segregated by gender type of deal?
So we're going to talk a little later about the role of women in the early church. Women held roles of authority, of basically funding, were leaders in the earlier church. There's no documentation of separation by gender in any of the worship service, including the baptism. So there's no differentiating by gender on the baptism or any of the earliest Christian rituals. In fact, what you see is women in leadership roles in the early church. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because it's also a memory that's been forgotten in our understanding of Christianity.
So
Anybody else?
obviously
Go ahead, Bernie.
there had to be some financial backing somehow. I mean, there's food, the white robes, the building of the baptismal areas and so forth. Where were these? Said earlier that these were basically the poor people. Another teacher said that Jesus served the people outside the wall because that's where the poor people were and so forth. Okay, now where's this financing coming from?
So in all of these communities, there's rich benefactors. And these rich benefactors, and we're going to see them when we come to Paul, because Paul's going to start the letter by saying, hey, thanks for the money, and a special call out to you. So we're going to actually see that in Paul's letters. All these early communities have some benefactors who are helping to bankroll them. So that's pretty key in all of this. But also, and we're going to see this in Paul's writing as well, these early communities really stressed that they need to be working. People need to be working and contributing to the life of the community. So it's both rich benefactors and everybody throwing in a little part of what is coming from their work. Go ahead, Shirley. Oh, you're on mute, Shirley.
Do we know if these members of these small groups lived close together or lived together?
I think there is some understanding that there was some communal living, but not a lot. It's more that they shared their assets and their food, and gave that the surplus out into that safety net. When we come to the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers, who are some of the earliest rebels against that emerging hierarchy, we're going to start to see these communities of faithful living together. Anyone else? Okay, let's talk a little bit about the martyrs, because there's a lot of perception, I think, about the persecution. And I'm actually going to start with a video.
Some of the oldest Christian communities were in western Turkey, where Paul and his followers had established many of the earliest congregations. At the end of the 1st century, Christians here found themselves in a confrontation with Roman power and authority.
About the year 112, an important event takes place that brings us on the stage in a new way in the history of earliest Christianity. The scene is in the Roman province of Bithynia in modern-day Turkey. At that time, there is a relatively new governor sent to take over. His name is Pliny the Younger.
Pliny was a friend of the Emperor Trajan and was an extremely respected Roman official.
One of Pliny's duties was to maintain order. In this capacity, he was presented with a legal and ethical problem, which he described in a letter to the Emperor Trajan.
Having never been present at any trials of the Christians, I am unacquainted with the methods or limits to be observed either in examining or punishing them.
So we have to imagine Pliny seated in the form of a Roman administrator, a Roman magistrate, all decked out in his finery, enthroned in the tribunal, with his guards and his bailiffs and his courtiers around him. And before him stand these Christians. And Pliny can't figure out who they are or why they're there. Apparently, they've done something that get their neighbors mad at them. The neighbors have complained that the temples are empty and no one's buying certain things for the gods, and they're Christians. And so somehow or another, Pliny is forced to deal with this as a criminal matter.
Pliny genuinely was perplexed because he sees what appears to be law-abiding citizens being hauled up on trumped-up charges of being a Christian, and simply on that basis, by convention, being subject to capital punishment. So I think Pliny allows us a rare glimpse into the moral and legal conundrum that Christianity posed for morally scrupulous Roman officials.
The method I have observed is this. I interrogated whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, I repeated the question twice again, adding the threat of capital punishment. If they still persevered, I ordered them to be executed.
Pliny allows in his correspondence how this really is one of the most stubborn groups of people he's ever encountered, and that in itself seems to warrant a rather strident attack on the Christians.
I judged it so much the more necessary to extract the real truth with the assistance of torture from 2 female slaves who were styled deaconesses, but I could discover nothing more than depraved and excessive superstition.
He says they don't really do all that much. They meet before daybreak. They sing hymns antiphonally. And they worship Christ as if he were a god. And then he says they take an oath, but not an oath to do anything bad, rather an oath only to be good, not to defraud people, not to do anything evil, and so on.
Those who denied they were or had ever been Christians, who repeated after me an invocation to the gods and offered adoration to your image, these I thought it proper to discharge.
And he says to the emperor, "Do you think I handled it correctly?" The emperor then writes back and says, "Sounds okay to me, but don't go out looking for these Christians, and if you get some anonymous charges against people, don't take that too seriously. We don't want to set any bad precedents here."
Before Pliny, legal precedent still held that Christians were a sect of Judaism.
Because it was considered a part of Judaism, Christianity was considered to be protected by the legal status of Jewish tradition within the Roman Empire. So when we see Pliny taking note of Christians as a separate group, it really marks a departure, a change in the status of Christianity, both in its relationship to Judaism and in its relationship to the Roman Empire.
Okay, so one of the things I love about this clip is, to Taylor's point about women, the two that he tortured were deaconesses. So they were women leaders of this community. And it really does, this is a historical document, preserved, non-Christian source, where it really does identify the start of the break and the differentiation between Judaism and the recognition by Rome that there's something new here, there's something different, and an early idea of what that strategy is going to be. Let me go ahead and share my slides. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about persecution. We're not going to get to clear all of this. So it started quite early. We know from Acts of the Apostles that Stephen, James died. Acts talks about them at the hands of fellow Jews. So again, that was in the earliest times where you had this Jewish sect emerging out of Judaism. But the majority of the persecutions occurred by Roman authority. So again, as we saw in the video, as Christianity splits from Judaism, it's losing its protected class. Under Judaism, it was protected in the Roman Empire as a distinct religion. It's losing that now. And it's a religion that is invalid. And again, not a lot of good perceptions about Christianity. So the first systemic persecution of Christians occurred in Rome in 64. This was under Nero. Poor sanitation, poor kind of urban blight had led to a massive fire. And Nero needed a scapegoat. And so he blamed the Christians. And so he rounded up a whole bunch of Christians and put them to death. So, but it wasn't a response to basically Christianity. He just was looking for somebody to blame the fire on. And it's thought that during this roundup is actually when both Peter and Paul died as well. At this time is where you start to see again that differentiation. And it was soon after this that becoming a Christian became a capital offense. For most of the first 3 centuries after Christ, it was illegal to be a Christian. Though, like you heard in the letter to Pliny and what the Roman emperor responded is, don't go seeking these people out. It was more, if persecution occurred, it was because of local authorities. It wasn't because Rome had a policy of seeking out and finding those individuals. It also depended not only on local authorities, but your neighbors, that if your neighbors wanted to make trouble for you, they could. Because of this kind of outside discrimination, persecution, it gave rise to what's known as the apologists. And those are people who start to defend the faith, the Christian faith, by writing letters, justifying what they're doing and why they're doing it. And these are some of the earliest writings that we have. Beyond those letters you're going to find in the New Testament, a lot of these have been preserved. I've shown you a couple from Justin Martyr, who was one of the earliest apologists. So they're going to start responding to these external factors of persecution by justifying and explaining who they are, the apologists, and it's going to start to form early doctrine. So let me just see. So I just want to make sure this is clear too. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we start next week. The fact that these were sporadic, it was not a theme of Roman policy to persecute the Christians. It was local. The numbers were not high. And it wasn't until much later, closer into the 300s, where you saw some more systematic kind of crusades against Christians. But the persecutions provided, I would say, a political platform that was very, very compelling. Tertullian writes this: the more you mow us down, the more we grow. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And next week, I'm going to start with a video that talks about the story of Felicity and Perpetua, who are two very, very famous martyrs. And one of them wrote a diary of her entire time. And it's one of the few diaries that we have preserved of a Christian martyr. So we'll start by talking about that. So the Christian martyrs were not high in numbers, but their impact was quite big in terms of the spread of Christianity. So that's where we'll start next week. In terms of kind of talking out, we'll finish up with the martyrs and the persecutions. And then we'll start to talk about that divide from Judaism. And we're going to then talk about, I want to talk about the role of women and Gnosticism. And some of you heard about Gnosticism in August. Reverend Michael preached from several Gnostic texts. So we're going to talk about Gnosticism, and we're going to talk about how we got a Bible and how we got church hierarchy. So that's the goal for next week. It's quite ambitious. We might get through some of it, not all of it. And it's okay because we'll just move Paul into November if we don't get through all of it. Okay? Any questions before we wrap up? Go ahead, Liz.
Well, it's just a comment that I noticed in the clip that you did of Pliny writing to the emperor. It seems as if the reasons that people were making these complaints against the Christians were economic reasons. They weren't going to the temple. They weren't buying the right kinds of things that they need to have for the gods and so forth. In other words, it's hitting us where it hurts in our business.
Right. Right.
So as you say, it could be a neighbor saying, basically, I don't like what you're doing, so I'll make a complaint against you.
Yep. Yep. And this whole concept of fitting in is really going to come up when we start to dive into Paul's letters, because Paul, we can look at him with contemporary eyes and say, what a jerk Paul was for how he told women to behave. There's a lot of scholars that look at what Paul wrote and said he was trying to keep people alive. He was trying to figure out how to help them survive in a very, very tenuous situation. Go ahead, Shirley.
I I wonder then if this meant the Jews were the protected class. Possibly there were other people in society who were not Jews or members of this early Christian sect, but weren't interested in the Roman gods. So then they wouldn't have been protected.
They wouldn't have been, but it was pretty simple to get along if you would just
By a statue.
pay your sacrifice, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. And the Christians were deliberately choosing to do something different in many different ways. And that's going to start to draw attention to them.
Well, it kind of makes me think of where some of the European countries are still now at this time, where they will ask you if you are a member of whatever the designated church for that particular country is, and you are taxed. You receive a tax on that church. So I mean, it sounds like that's something that's just come down from the Roman Empire, possibly.
Maybe. Don, did you have a question?
I did.
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
So the early converts to Christianity were Jewish, from the Jewish synagogue. At what point did it become not just Jewish people, but
Yep. So the earliest followers of Christ were Jewish. They weren't converts. They were Jewish, and they believed that they were living out being a good Jew. And so they were operating within the Jewish system, keeping the Jewish law, observing Jewish Sabbath and food laws. And so they were good Jews living within the Jewish structure who just believed that the Messiah had come and it was Jesus. But that was all within Judaism. By the end of the first century, you're starting to see the Gentile focus, people who were not Jewish, starting to be the predominant component. And so the Jewish component is going to slip and slip, and that Gentile piece is going to grow and grow. So by the end of that first century, you're really seeing more the Gentile input.
So that kind of coincides with them losing their status.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yep.
Were there multiple branches of Judaism?
Yes, multiple branches. So you've got the Essenes who said, screw this, we're going to go live in the hillside. And they're the ones that buried and preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've got the Zealots, you've got the apocalyptic thinkers, you've got the Pharisees, the Sadducees, lots of variation, just like within every religion, there's going to be lots of different ways that's lived out.
Thank you.
Okay, next week we'll wrap up with persecution. That's how we'll start. Good way to start the day, right? And then we'll talk a little bit about how this all became so formal. So that'll be next Tuesday at 1 o'clock. Okay?
Thanks.
Okay, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.